In 22 minutes, I lost my entire career. But they'll lose their empire in just 8 weeks. That thought settled in my mind as the clock above the conference room ticked toward 9 a.m. The room felt colder than usual, the air thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and something far less palatable, betrayal. Madison Crowell sat at the head of the long oak table, legs elegantly crossed, fingers tapping a silent, infuriating rhythm against the polished surface. Her lipstick was the color of blood, and I had the distinct feeling it wasn't a coincidence. Her eyes locked onto mine as if she'd already loaded the final round in the chamber. "Let's get straight to it," she announced, her voice slicing through the idle murmurs like a scalpel. I didn't need a combat radar to know this was an ambush. Madison leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into that corporate predator's smile. "Marcus," she began, savoring my name like it was something foul on her tongue, "your leadership style is antiquated. Too rigid for where Crimson Axis is headed." A few chuckles rippled through the room, thin, pathetic things. I caught Derek Hanley, head of strategic development, smirking behind his coffee cup. The same guy who'd once begged me to save his botched contract negotiations 2 years ago. Then Madison delivered the kill shot. "The rear lines of the military might have taught you logistics, Marcus," she said, loud enough for every executive to hear, "but they didn't teach you how to survive on the front lines of financial warfare. You're out of your depth. And frankly, you've lost." The words hit harder than a sucker punch, but years of battlefield discipline kept my face impassive. My knuckles tightened around the edge of the table, not out of anger, but calculation. I swept my gaze across the room. Cowards. Every last one of them except for Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor didn't avert her eyes. Her pale blue gaze met mine, brimming with a silent apology she wasn't allowed to voice in this pit of wolves. Her hands, usually steady, fidgeted with the corner of her tablet. I stood, calm and deliberate. Closed my laptop with a soft, final click, and pushed my chair back. The chair's legs dragged against the marble floor with a sharp, grating screech that echoed through the sudden silence. Even Madison blinked. "Noted," I said, my voice low but carrying across the room like a final command on a battlefield. Madison wasn't finished, though. Oh no, she had one last knife to twist. She stood gracefully, smoothing down her designer skirt, and addressed the room like a queen announcing a new era. "I'm pleased to share," she said, her tone dripping with triumph, "that Crimson Axis has finalized a strategic partnership with Kestrel Capital. Together, we'll usher in a new age of technological innovation and financial growth. Our future lies not in outdated supplier relationships or handshake deals but in scalable, digitized procurement strategies." I almost smiled right then. She'd just signed the company's death warrant and didn't even know it. They would try to replicate what I built using spreadsheets and sterile management platforms. They thought trust could be coded into a vendor portal and loyalty uploaded like a software patch. Madison looked back at me, her chin lifted arrogantly. "I'm sure you understand, Marcus. It's simply time for fresh leadership. Good luck out there." For the first time in years, I let the corner of my mouth twitch into the faintest of smirks. "Oh, I will," I said softly. And with that, I walked out. I didn't take the grand exit through the lobby where the vultures would be circling, ready to pick apart the carcass of my career. Instead, I went straight to my office. No hesitation. 22 minutes. That's all I allowed myself. I moved efficiently. One box for the personal things, barely half full. The framed photo of my daughter, gone too soon, tucked carefully between a spare blazer and my old army service coin. And one sleek, black USB drive slipped silently into the inside pocket of my coat. That little device held every critical supplier contact, every negotiated price point, every delivery schedule optimized down to the hour. The beating heart of Crimson Axis's supply chain. Not that they'd asked for a transition plan. Madison didn't believe in handovers, she believed in burn the ship's leadership. When I stepped out of my office for the last time, Eleanor was standing by the elevators, waiting. She glanced left and right before stepping closer. Her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't deserve that." I held her gaze for a long second. "It's not about what I deserved," I said. "It's about what comes next." The elevator dinged, its doors sliding open with mechanical indifference. I stepped in, turned back to her just as the doors began to close. "Tell them good luck with their new era, Eleanor." And then I was gone. Out on the street, the cold morning air hit me like a baptism. I took a long breath, the kind you take before a battle you already know you'll win. I wasn't angry. I wasn't defeated. I was calculating. And by the time those office lights dimmed 8 weeks from now, the empire they thought they'd secured would be nothing more than a smoldering ruin. They just didn't know it yet. The bitter chill of that morning hadn't yet left my bones when I found myself back at my apartment, a modest corner unit overlooking the gray waters of the Dakota River. The city skyline across the water looked like a battlefield of forgotten promises, glass towers reaching skyward while their foundations crumbled under the weight of unseen wars. I stood by the window, the USB drive in my hand, feeling its weight like a final chess piece waiting for the right moment to strike. My reflection stared back at me, a man who'd spent nearly a decade building something real, only to have it dismissed by a woman wearing designer arrogance and a boardroom full of cowards. But before I could plan what came next, I had to remember how it all began. 7 years ago, Crimson Axis was a company in freefall. Back then, the numbers were bleeding red ink, barely $5 million in annual revenue, most of it clinging desperately to outdated contracts and a supply chain so fragile it broke under the weight of a light breeze. That was before they called me in. Ronald Granger, the company's founder and one of the last honest engineers I've ever met, sat across from me in a cluttered office overlooking the rail yards of Riverbend. His hands were thick with grease despite his title, sleeves rolled up like he'd never fully left the shop floor. "I don't need another paper pusher in a suit," he'd grunted. "I need someone who knows how to fix this mess. Someone who understands systems. Military systems." I'd sat quietly, my old army service ring cold against my knuckles, scanning the disaster mapped out on the whiteboard behind him, delivery failures, vendor collapses, parts shortages. "How much authority are we talking about?" I asked finally. Ronald grinned. "You bring this place back from the dead, Marcus, and you can have the keys to the damn kingdom." Funny thing was, I didn't want his kingdom. I just wanted to build something that worked. My first year at Crimson Axis wasn't spent behind a desk. It was spent behind the wheel of a battered Chevy Silverado, clocking over 30,000 miles, visiting every critical supplier personally. From Mason City, Iowa to Rockford, Illinois, I shook hands in machine shops where the air smelled of hot metal and cutting oil. I sat at kitchen tables with small business owners, listened to their frustrations, their fears about rising steel prices and the looming recession. And I remembered their kids' names. Not because it was a tactic, because it was the right damn thing to do. I built something no procurement software or vendor portal ever could, trust. By year 3, we had the most resilient supply network in the Midwest. When the global supply chain collapsed in 2023, while competitors shut down production lines, we kept running. Our on-time delivery rate hit 98.6%, and customer retention climbed to 91%. Ronald used to call me into his office once a month just to shake my hand. "Best investment I ever made, bringing you in," he'd say, his voice thick with pride. And then, like all good stories, it started to unravel. The breaking point came during the steel shortage crisis of 2023. A critical order from our biggest client, Falcon Dynamics, was about to fall apart. Their military-grade robotics components required a specialized steel alloy only produced by a small plant in Evansville, Indiana. Madison Crowell, back then just a rising star on the board, insisted we cancel the order and outsource the part overseas. "It's not worth the logistics nightmare," she'd said with that same condescending smirk she wore the day she fired me. But I knew better. That contract was the cornerstone of our 5-year growth plan. So, I did what needed to be done. I drove 600 kilometers through the night, through a brutal snowstorm that shut down half the interstates. Pulled into the parking lot of Carson Alloys just before dawn, boots crunching over frozen gravel. I walked straight into the plant manager's office, Jim Carson, a man I'd shared more whiskeys with than I cared to admit, and convinced him to prioritize our order. Not with threats, not with discounts, but with one simple promise. Jim, you give me this, and I'll make sure your people stay working through the next 6 months. We don't just need your steel. You need our orders. Let's keep each other alive. He shook my hand, calloused and rough, and that handshake saved the company. Falcon Dynamics renewed their contract a week later. Madison hated me for that. She didn't like problems solved outside her control. She especially didn't like that Ronald praised me in front of the entire board. Looking back now, that night on the road wasn't just a victory, it was the first shot fired in a silent war I didn't know had started. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, there was Eleanor. She was the calm in the middle of every storm. Sharp-minded, relentlessly organized, always one step ahead in finance meetings. But it was the little things that lingered, how her eyes lingered a beat too long on me during quarterly reviews, how her fingers tapped out anxious rhythms when she disagreed with the board but couldn't say it aloud. On my 45th birthday, she left a small black box on my desk. No card. No words. Inside was a fountain pen. Simple. Elegant. The initials MH etched in silver along the barrel. I never used it. Couldn't bring myself to. That pen sat in my desk drawer for 2 years, a silent reminder of things left unsaid and moments I wasn't brave enough to take. Until today. Today, when I walked out of Crimson Axis for the last time, that pen wasn't left behind. It was in my pocket, right next to the USB drive holding the company's lifeblood. And something told me I'd be needing both soon enough. There's a funny thing about corporate warfare, everyone loves to talk about the big, flashy victories. But real power? Real control? It's hidden in the margins, buried in the footnotes of contracts no one bothers to read. And that's exactly where I left my traps. In the final months before Madison Crowell staged her little coup, I'd quietly restructured every major supplier agreement under what I called dynamic renegotiation clauses. The language was clean, almost elegant in its simplicity, but the implications were a loaded gun waiting to go off. Every critical contract required annual renewal. No auto-extensions. No evergreen clauses. Each partnership had to be personally renegotiated or it would lapse. On the surface, it looked like good governance. Best practices, as the consultants would say. But buried beneath that corporate jargon was the reality: without me, those renegotiations would stall, and when they stalled, the flow of parts, materials, and priority pricing would grind to a halt. I didn't violate a single non-compete clause. I didn't reach out to a single supplier after I left. I didn't have to. The other piece of the puzzle was even more delicate. I'd spent years fine-tuning Crimson Axis's supply chain into a masterpiece of just-in-time delivery. It was fast. Efficient. Lean to the point of brilliance. But like all things built for speed, it had choke points, pressure valves that needed constant adjustment. And I was the only one who knew where they were. Those weren't documented in any spreadsheet. No process map detailed how to navigate an unexpected shortage from the ceramic composite plant in Rockford, or who to call when the plastic supplier in Mason City ran a skeleton crew over the holidays. That knowledge lived up here, in my head, and they threw that out the door with me. A week after my so-called dismissal, I sat across from Amara Fields, the enigmatic CEO of Sterling Nexus, at a quiet corner table of Bellamy's Steakhouse. Amara was a rare breed in this business, sharp as a razor but patient enough to let others bleed themselves out first. She wore power like a tailored suit, and when she looked at you, you felt both seen and assessed. "We need a resurrection, Marcus," she said plainly, cutting into her steak like she was dissecting a deal. And I think you're the man who knows how to bring a company back from the brink. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the conversation settle. I don't do charity work, Amara. Her lips twitched into the faintest smile. Good. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a 5% equity stake, provided you stabilize our supply chain and grow our revenue within 2 years. I stared at my untouched drink, thinking about all the years I'd poured into Crimson Axis, all the nights spent fixing problems that no one even knew existed. And then I thought about Madison Crowell's smug little speech and how sweet it would be to dismantle her new era without firing a single shot. I reached into my coat pocket, fingers brushing against the cool metal of the fountain pen Eleanor had given me. Its new engraving pressed against my skin like a reminder, patience is a weapon. I looked up and nodded. You've got yourself a deal. The next day, I drove out to Mason City. Not to negotiate. Not to make promises. I simply showed up at Miller Plastics, the family-owned supplier I'd personally kept afloat during the worst of the recession. I stood at the edge of their loading docks, hands in my coat pockets, watching as their trucks rolled out late and half-empty. Eventually, Tom Miller, third-generation owner, spotted me and walked over, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Didn't think I'd see you around these parts again," he said. "Didn't think you'd have so many idle machines, Tom." He sighed, the weight of a dozen unrenewed contracts pressing down on his shoulders. "Things ain't what they used to be. Crowell's people talk like they're already kings of the hill. They're pushing supplier portals, automated scheduling. Hell, they even tried to get me to cut my payment terms by 30 days. Like I'm their goddamn bank. I didn't offer a solution. I didn't need to." Tom studied me for a long moment. "You working again?" he finally asked. I just smiled. "Not in the way you're thinking. But if you ever want to talk about how we used to do things, you know where to find me." I turned and walked away, leaving just enough space for the memory of our past partnerships to do the heavy lifting. That's how it went for the next 3 weeks. I visited every supplier that mattered. Sat at their favorite diners. Dropped by warehouses under the pretense of passing through. Never once pitched a deal. And yet, slowly, inevitably, word began to spread. The man who built the most resilient supply network in the Midwest wasn't gone. He was simply repositioning. Back at Sterling Nexus, I spent my nights plotting the next phase. I wasn't looking to just recover a company. I wanted to build a fortress, one Madison and her precious Kestrel capital couldn't touch. Every vendor I spoke with told me the same thing: Crimson Axis had started missing deliveries. Payments were delayed. Their shiny new vendor management software couldn't negotiate goodwill or fix broken promises. And every time I heard it, I thought of Madison standing in that boardroom, smiling like a queen atop a crumbling throne. Her empire was already starting to crack. She just hadn't noticed it yet. It started with late shipments. Small things at first: fasteners arriving a day late, specialty alloys missing their delivery windows by a week. But in a supply chain built on precision timing, small things become big problems fast. By week 4, Crimson Axis was bleeding contracts faster than Madison Crowell could spin her glossy PR statements. I watched it all unfold like a slow-motion train wreck. From the comfort of my new corner office at Sterling Nexus, I tracked every late delivery report, every supplier complaint. The market doesn't forgive broken promises, and Madison had made a habit of them. And yet, she kept her chin high. Publicly defiant. At the North American Industrial Technologies Summit, an annual gathering of the industry's most influential players, Madison took the stage like she was still royalty, striding out in a custom-tailored blazer worth more than some of my old contracts. She smiled that same venom-laced smile and dropped a thinly veiled accusation into her keynote address. "Some individuals," she said, voice dripping with saccharine confidence, "believe business relationships are built on backroom handshakes and favors. That's old-world thinking. Our future lies in data-driven optimization, in cutting outdated emotional dependencies. And if certain actors are sabotaging progress from the shadows, well, we'll let the numbers speak for themselves. The room hummed with polite laughter, but I caught the quick glances exchanged between executives. They weren't laughing. They were nervous. I leaned back in my seat, fingers tracing the engraved message on my fountain pen. Patience is a weapon. Madison still thought she was playing chess. She didn't realize she was already a pawn in a much larger game. A week later, the plot thickened. I was in my office, reviewing a draft of a multi-year procurement deal with Falcon Dynamics, when a secure message landed in my inbox. From Ronald Granger. Subject line, "We need to talk." Immediately. I called him before the email even finished decrypting. His voice came through low and rough, like he'd aged 10 years in the last few months. "She's selling, Marcus," he said. "To Kestrel Capital." My heart stilled for a beat. Kestrel. I'd heard whispers about them, an ultra-aggressive private equity firm making quiet moves across the tech and manufacturing sectors. Their strategy was ruthless: acquire undervalued companies, strip them of assets, offshore production, and dump the skeletons for tax write-offs. "This is confirmed?" I asked. "She signed the preliminary agreement 2 days ago," Ronald confirmed. "They're positioning it as a strategic realignment. But you and I both know what that really means. She's gutting the company to make the books look lean for a fast flip." So Madison hadn't just stumbled into failure, she'd engineered it. She wasn't a fool. She was a saboteur playing a long con. It explained everything. The sudden pivot to automated vendor systems. The reckless cost-cutting. The public dismissal of old partnerships. She'd orchestrated Crimson Axis's downfall from the inside, driving it into the ground just far enough to justify a sale while making herself look like the necessary sacrifice for the greater good. But she'd underestimated one thing. Me. If she thought I'd stand by while she burned down everything I built and sold the ashes to the highest bidder, she didn't understand who she'd made an enemy of. That night, I sat in my apartment with the city lights flickering beyond the Dakota River, mapping out the final move. The pen Eleanor gave me sat beside a glass of untouched bourbon. The words "patience is a weapon" seemed to glow under the desk lamp. I picked up my phone and made 2 calls. First, to Thomas Aldridge at Falcon Dynamics. "Thomas," I said without preamble, "how would you feel about securing a guaranteed 3-year supply agreement with Sterling Nexus? Priority delivery, locked pricing, and dedicated production capacity." He didn't hesitate. "Put it in writing, Marcus. I'll sign it tomorrow." That contract would be my leverage. My second call was to Ronald Granger. "Ronald," I said, leaning back and closing my eyes, "it's time we brought Crimson Axis home. But we do it my way." "Your way being?" "You're going to approach Madison's investors as a concerned former owner with deep industry ties. Tell them you've identified a private buyer interested in acquiring the company's assets before the financials crater next quarter. But keep my name out of it." He chuckled darkly. "You're playing this close to the chest. That's the only way to play it now." Within 3 days, Ronald confirmed that the investors, spooked by plummeting performance metrics and the impending disaster Madison's leadership had become, were open to negotiations. Desperate, even. They wanted out before the house of cards collapsed completely. But they didn't know that I had already arranged Sterling Nexus's manufacturing lines to absorb Crimson Axis's contracts seamlessly. With Falcon Dynamics locked in, and a handful of other former Crimson Axis clients already quietly shifting their business to us, Madison's kingdom was nothing but a crumbling facade. And I was standing at the door, ready to claim the wreckage. The final meeting was set. Sterling Nexus would make the offer through a shell acquisition group, with Ronald presenting the terms. The price? A fraction of Crimson Axis's peak valuation. But it wasn't just about the acquisition. It was about the moment Madison Crowell would finally realize the magnitude of her mistake, that the man she publicly humiliated, the man she dismissed as obsolete, had orchestrated her downfall from the shadows. And she'd never even seen it coming. The morning of the meeting arrived wrapped in silence. Not the kind that soothed you, but the kind that thrummed beneath your skin, a quiet charged with consequence. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting the cuffs of my black suit. It was tailored, sharp, but not flashy. I didn't dress to impress Madison Crowell. I dressed to bury her. Tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket was Eleanor's fountain pen. I'd had it re-engraved 2 weeks ago. The new words were simple. Patience is a weapon. Today, I was pulling the trigger. The elevator to the 25th floor of Crimson Axis's corporate tower opened precisely at 8:59 a.m. By 9 o'clock, I stepped into the conference room with measured calm. The room was already occupied, Ronald Granger at the far end, flanked by the lead counsel for the investors, 2 stiff men in identical charcoal suits. On the other side sat Sterling Nexus's acquisition team. And at the head of the table, like a queen who hadn't yet realized her kingdom was on fire, sat Madison Crowell. Her eyes lifted, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't hide the fracture in her composure. Her breath caught. Her fingers, always perfectly manicured, froze mid-adjustment of her blazer cuff. "Marcus," she said, her voice strained. "What is this?" I walked to the empty chair beside Ronald, sat down slowly, and placed Eleanor's pen neatly in front of me. Ronald turned toward the table. "Let me be clear," he said, voice level. "The buyer of Crimson Axis Technologies assets is Sterling Nexus. And Mr. Marcus Harlow will be leading the post-acquisition integration." Madison's eyes flicked between faces. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "You're selling the company to him?" One of the investors cleared his throat. "The board has already signed the preliminary agreement. Effective immediately, the asset transfer will begin." "No," Madison snapped, rising to her feet. "This is a setup. He's the one who sabotaged our supplier relationships. He poisoned the well before he left." I finally spoke. Calm. Controlled. Lethal. "I haven't contacted a single Crimson Axis vendor since the day I walked out of this building. Phone records. Emails. Sworn statements. Everything's been audited. I made sure of that." She stared at me, stunned. "But, then how?" I leaned forward slightly, tapping the fountain pen once against the mahogany table. "What you're experiencing," I said, voice just above a whisper, "is the natural consequence of treating partnerships like transactions, and people like tools." I picked up the acquisition documents, flipped to the signature page, uncapped the pen, and signed. The sound of the nib scratching against paper was the only noise in the room. And then I capped the pen again and said the words I'd waited months to deliver. "You thought you were playing chess, Madison. But you forgot the most important rule, the one who waits the longest holds the last move." Madison sank into her chair like air had been ripped from her lungs. The investors didn't offer her a look of support. Not even a shrug. The lead one, Jeffrey Chen, a stone-faced tactician who only spoke when necessary, simply reached into his briefcase, pulled out a folded document, and slid it across the table. "Your separation terms," he said coldly. "I built this company," she hissed, eyes now bloodshot. "I'm the one who signed Kestrel." "And you also signed away our credibility," Chen cut in. "And our supplier loyalty. And our revenue." He stood. "Good luck finding another boardroom to ruin." Her hands trembled as she reached for the paper, her manicured fingers twitching with fury. She didn't sign it. Not then. She just stood slowly, clutching her handbag, and paused at the doorway. Her eyes, once filled with condescension and control, now burned with something much darker. Hatred. But more than that, understanding. She realized, at last, what I was. Not a casualty. Not a relic. I was the architect of her downfall. The room emptied over the next 10 minutes, voices hushed, energy subdued. Ronald clapped me on the shoulder before leaving. "Hell of a checkmate, Marcus," he said. But I wasn't smiling. Not yet. Because when I returned to my seat, I found a small, cream-colored envelope sitting on the table. No name. Just sealed shut in red wax. It hadn't been there a moment ago. I broke the seal and unfolded the single piece of paper inside. The handwriting was clean. Elegant. Familiar in a way that made my gut twist. "You think you've won?" The board was never the game. The company was never the prize. "You're still thinking too small, Marcus. The board is bigger than you know. K." I read the note twice. Then a third time. K. Not Madison. That wasn't her handwriting. And she didn't talk like that. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was something larger. Strategic. Embedded. Kestrel. The firm Madison had signed with wasn't just a vulture picking at dying companies, it was a syndicate, carving through the American industrial base like a cancer. And Madison hadn't been their queen. She'd been a bishop. A sacrificial piece, useful until she wasn't. I slipped the note into my jacket, next to the pen, and stared out the window toward the river. Across the water, the wind stirred, carrying the scent of change. That evening, I stayed late in the newly renamed Nexus Axis Operations HQ. I walked the floors alone, the same floors I'd once walked with a clipboard and calloused hands, now as the man who owned the future of this place. Eleanor found me near the old break room. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me, watching the production line move smoothly again for the first time in months. "You did it," she said finally. "No," I replied quietly. "We did. You kept the lights on when I was gone. You warned me. You stayed." She smiled softly, and then her eyes dropped to my chest pocket. "Still carrying the pen?" she asked. I tapped the fabric gently. "It's seen some things. Would you ever use it?" I turned toward her. "I did today." The silence between us held something warm. Not romantic, not yet. But something understood. Trusted. And in that silence, I remembered the note. I pulled it from my jacket and handed it to her. Her face darkened as she read it. "What does it mean?" she asked. I looked past her, toward the city lights blinking in the distance. "It means the war's not over," I said. "Not by a long shot." And in that moment, I knew, I hadn't just torn down one woman's vanity. I'd uncovered a deeper rot, one that needed burning at the roots. But that would come later. Tonight, I allowed myself one breath. One quiet, victorious moment. Because Madison Crowell had finally fallen. And tomorrow, the bigger game would begin. The truth rarely arrives with fanfare. It slips in quietly, like a shadow under a locked door, waiting for the moment you're ready, or too tired to resist. For me, it came as a quiet file, slid across my desk late one evening by a courier who refused to give his name. I sat there alone in my office, the city lights of Riverbend blinking like distant signals across the Dakota River. The wax seal on the envelope bore a simple, stylized falcon crest, its wings outstretched, talons drawn. Kestrel. With practiced calm, I broke the seal and unfolded the contents. There it was in black and white. K wasn't a person. It was a machine. A cold, calculating financial war engine disguised as an investment firm. Kestrel Capital. Their internal codename for this operation. Project Dominion. The objectives were horrifyingly simple. Acquire American manufacturing companies at their weakest moments. Strip them of assets, intellectual property, and patents. Shift production overseas to cut costs, leaving towns and workers behind. Resell the hollowed shells as tax-friendly liabilities or bankrupt remnants. And Madison Crowell? She wasn't just a casualty of their game. She was a promoted piece on the board. Her new title, Executive Partner, North American Expansion Division, Kestrel Capital. She had willingly walked through the flames of her own destruction, knowing she'd rise higher than ever before. And now she held the keys to their next phase, targeting companies far larger than Crimson Axis, companies that formed the backbone of the American industrial heartland. I closed the file, the weight of it heavier than any physical object. Madison hadn't lost. She had evolved. I could almost admire it, if the cost of her ambition weren't paid in lost livelihoods and shuttered factories. The door creaked open behind me. I didn't have to turn to know it was Eleanor. Her presence was familiar now, like the grounding calm before a storm. Without a word, she crossed the room and stood beside me, her eyes scanning the untouched bourbon on my desk before falling on the open dossier. She read quickly. Efficiently. Her fingers trembled only once, when she reached the section detailing Kestrel's plans for Sterling Nexus itself. Yes, I said before she could ask. We're on their list. Silence hung between us like a held breath. And then, softly, she placed her hand on my shoulder. Her voice was low, steady, but carried the weight of something deeply personal. Are you ready to fight again, Marcus? She asked. I turned toward her, really seeing her for the first time in what felt like weeks. This time, she added, don't fight for the company. Fight for yourself. Her hand lingered a second longer before she stepped back, leaving me alone with her words. I returned to the window, my eyes tracing the restless churn of the Dakota River. This wasn't just a battle for market share anymore. It was a war for the soul of American industry. Factories weren't just steel and concrete. They were communities. Families. Histories written in sweat and calloused hands. And Kestrel. They were erasing all of it with the stroke of a pen. I took out Eleanor's fountain pen, feeling the weight of it in my palm. The engraving caught the faint moonlight. Patience is a weapon. I had waited long enough. Now, it was time to strike back. I looked toward the churning waters of the Dakota River. This time, the rising tide wasn't just a market shift. It was a reckoning. And I wouldn't be standing against it. I'd be leading it. In every battle, victory doesn't belong to the strongest, it belongs to those who wait for the right moment to strike. But beyond revenge lies something more important, a quiet defiance against those who believe everything, even human dignity, has a price. And for people like us, that's the one thing never up for sale.